So we're going to talk about freedom because one of the most frustrating things I see when I watch online debates, when I watch all kinds of different stuff between two people, is that they never define their terms in the beginning, and usually if they're of two completely different viewpoints, they're pretty much talking past each other because, if you're in certain groups, like we just know if you're someone that dabbles a lot in memes, you probably know a lot of terms that other people do not know. If you're part of a certain music genre community, there are a lot of terms that you know that other people don't know. If you're part of, like, depending on the country you live in, obviously there are loads of terms that are restricted to just a certain group of people, and they might even be the same terms but with different definitions across different communities as well. So when I see people talking about freedom, I think pretty much everyone, there's very few people I've seen that have said they're anti-freedom, and yet we are all fighting over this. Yet everyone is all like, well, I oppose this kind of freedom or this kind of freedom, or I disagree with that, or like, it's all down to defining what freedom is. So just remember that starting out, we need to make sure we define freedom. Same thing with like capitalism, for example. When Marxists complain about capitalism, they include crony capitalism. They include like fascism in that. They say fascism is a bit capitalist and certain things like that. Whereas obviously, if you are someone that identifies as like pro-capitalist or a libertarian or a small government conservative, capitalism does not include the crony capitalism thing. You're defining things differently. Your criteria for capitalism is different. And now, who has the right definition, who is the wrong? Typically, I go with who identifies as such and who is putting forth the idea. But then you can also say, well, the Marxists were the ones that came up with the term capitalist first. That whole thing, like, I'm not trying to get into which definition is correct, but only to acknowledge that there are two different definitions here. And that's important. Remember, that is super important, because as soon as you start talking about freedom, if you haven't defined it, if you're talking to freedom, if you hold the constrained view of the world and someone else holds the unconstrained view, and you start debating freedom, you're going to run into some conflicts pretty quickly, and you're going to start talking past each other without actually defining what freedom is, because you're going to be talking about two separate things. So if you don't know what I mean by constrained versus unconstrained, that's something you need to look up, something you need to learn about, because that's a nice alternative to the like left-right political spectrum that I found to be very useful. It's something by, I don't know if Thomas Sowell came up with it or if he just clarified it, but it's in his book, A Conflict of Visions. I have a review of that book on this channel, which I'll leave in the description. It's only like 4 minutes long. And I also have another video where I go more in depth on what that is, on that view, which again I'll leave that in the description as well. I recommend you watch one of those. But just to give you a quick definition, constrained view is the tragic view, the view that humanity is as they are, and we got to build society around how humanity is. They focus more on systems and incentive structures and just like the methodology itself of society. Whereas the unconstrained view is more, they view humanity as more malleable, as more like, as Steven Pinker wrote in his book, The Blank Slate, they hold the view that human beings are more of a blank slate, and society changes humanity in certain ways, and we can make human beings more charitable, more giving, or more honest, or more selfish, or cruel, or mean, depending on the society and how we manage that. So they take it, but they're also more, the unconstrained view is more results oriented, and I tend to see them as more on the left, but again, it's not a specific left-right spectrum. They tend to be more on the left. They're focused more on results, whereas the people in the constrained view, who's more on the right, the more conservative types, are focused more on the system itself, as I said. So to give you an idea of freedom, it's more of freedom to do something, or freedom without oppression, versus freedom from consequences. So to give you an idea of like a perfect example of what is freedom and what isn't, think of a desert island. You are on a desert island. It doesn't have to be a desert island. You are on an island, period. There's no one around you. You're not part of any government jurisdiction. No laws, nothing. You are alone. Whether or not you have food or water or anything, that's completely different, but let's assume you don't have healthcare, you don't have education, because again, there's nobody. So from the more constrained view, the more right-wing, like libertarian perspective, that would be peak freedom. Now, they're not saying that is the best society. Like, we're not saying that even though that's peak freedom, that's all what we would prefer to live in. We're not saying that that even though it's peak freedom, that there aren't other things that are also important too. But that's the general idea of there is nobody there to oppress you. Nature, you can't say nature is oppressing you. You can't say that because you can't do X, because you can't get an education, that you're not free, because nobody is oppressing you. You can make all of the choices at hand, and nobody is there to stop you. Of course, once you go to society in general, as long as government isn't using force against you, as long as nobody is using force against you, you're still in peak freedom. Because even though everyone's around you, again, you are free to do whatever you want. There are obviously consequences of reality. So, for example, someone on a desert island, if there's abundant food, I cannot say I cannot stop eating and say I don't have the freedom to not eat and still stay alive. That's not viewed as freedom. It's simple. Here are your choices at hand. You can do X, but there are obvious consequences. But nobody is changing those. Nobody is controlling you in that sense. That's actually a key word there. Control. Nobody is controlling you. So that's essentially the libertarian definition, where you can say that a businessman or someone hires you, and they might treat you poorly, but that's not necessarily oppression as long as they don't have the arm of government to force you to do anything. You are free to leave. So you can say, there are consequences of that job, but you are free to leave at all times. So in that sense, you still have freedom because you still have choices in that manner. And choices limited to reality in general. Again, we can't say that nature is oppressing you because you don't have the freedom not to eat and still survive, or you don't have the freedom to overeat and not get fat, that kind of thing. It's not any kind of lack of freedom that you get fat when you overeat, or you have a heart attack when you overeat. That is just reality. That is just the situation at hand, and there's no kind of oppression there. So we can say you're still peak freedom. You still have freedom even if you get fat when you eat, because again, that's just reality. That's just nature. That's the state of nature. As long as someone isn't controlling you in a certain way or stopping you from doing something that you would normally have the free option to do in a state of nature, they're not oppressing you. So when you have access to healthcare and education because you can afford it, or because you're making business deals through capitalism, through the free market, capitalism is, in a sense, peak freedom because nobody's controlling you. You're free to make decisions. People are free to say, I don't want to make a deal with you. But in the end, you still have all of those decisions, and there are natural consequences to that, sure. So again, I have the right, you could say, in peak freedom, I have the right to do drugs, but I don't have the right to not die from those drugs, to not get sick, to not get addicted. That is a consequence of reality, that if you take an addictive substance, you might get addicted. So that is, in a sense, just reality. We're not saying that there is a lack of freedom there at all. But once the government makes something illegal, then they are restricting your freedom because you had a choice in a regular state of nature, and now you don't. If someone says, oh, well, the consequences are now that we're going to throw you in jail for doing this substance. Well, the difference is there that, again, someone is controlling you now. They're managing you in a certain way. They're taking control of your choices, and those choices are now different from what you would have in a regular state of nature. Now, again, we're not saying freedom is the most important thing, or we're not saying freedom is the only important thing, because, of course, if being alone on an island is peak freedom, but most of us, the vast majority of us, would choose the society we have now with government, or with restrictions, with a powerful government. We would still prefer that over peak freedom in a sense, because society is there are benefits to living in a society that outweigh that. But of course, I do want to emphasize that the fact that nobody is there doesn't make it peak freedom. It's more the fact that nobody is there to control you, in a sense. Now, again, incentives. Like, someone can say, I don't want to be your friend if you're going to act like this. That is not controlling you, in a sense. That is them exercising their right. Now, if someone says, again, I'm going to force you to do something, like physical violence, then it's oppression. But now on to the other definition of freedom that tends to be more on the left. They're talking about the freedom of results. So the right not to die from a disease, the right not to, or the right to an education, that you have freedom if you have a government subsidized education, because before you didn't have the freedom to get an education. That option was not open to you. Whereas now, if government subsidizes education, now that option is open to you. You now have that choice that you didn't have before. So in that sense, it's a freedom to do more. It's a freedom that this avenue of this option was not open to you before, but now it is. That is more freedom. And I can kind of see that perspective, but I reject it. Because they're focused more on results. On more the kind of freedom where essentially, like, how many options do you have? Like a society where we've invented some kind of drug and it's free from the government, where if you eat something you don't get fat. To them, that is to that definition of freedom, you now have more freedom because you now have an extra option that you didn't before. You have an extra choice. But again, to the constrained view, and more so, the more right-wing like constrained view would then say it's not about how many options you have. It's more about just the natural state of things. The what do you like? Again, the are you being controlled by another person? Whereas again, on the left would say, okay, well, if I have if the government funds and subsidizes things, well, now I have more freedom because they are giving me more options. Whereas again, the right-wing view generally says, no, that's not freedom. It's because they're taking taxpayer dollars. They're taking things from you by force and spending it on government programs. So that's not a form of freedom. But hopefully that makes sense. I just want to say that's the results versus system kind of thing. Whereas the right wing is the more you have the right to participate in a system without being anything forced upon you. Whereas the left is more how many options are open to you that and that can be manipulated. Again, like it's not natural that the government could fund for free and give you some kind of drug that stops you from getting addicted or stops you from getting fat when you eat. That is in a sense a kind of freedom, but that's not the kind of freedom that like the more libertarian types would talk about. Under capitalism, sure you could say it is, if capitalists come up with that system and they come up with it, but freedom from consequences is not is more of it seems the more unconstrained view rather than the constrained. But to go into the definition, I want to just go through the definitions quick to show how people can interpret that in two different ways. So for one, noun freedom, the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. So again, that comes down to like the freedom from government oppression or anything. So the left, I guess, more takes the approach of, well, recently they've been taking the anti-free speech approach. But more talking about here like the act, speak, or think. So in the constrained view, you have the right to act, speak, or think. You have the right to your body. You have the right to do whatever you want to your body within the constraints of nature and reality. And as long as you're not restricting someone else's right, that kind of thing. So that is a sense that is something that kind of overlaps more with both. But then again, the more unconstrained view, the more left view seems to take the approach of, again, freedom to, like, do you really have freedom if you can't afford food? Do you really have freedom if you can't afford X or if you can't do this? Do you really have the right to freedom if you decide not to work and you die, kind of thing? Where if you see in the most radical quote in Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal was for those a right to something, a right to, I forget exactly what it was, a right to like some kind of like standard of living essentially for those unable or unwilling to work. So in that sense, if you are unwilling to work, like you should have the freedom to get access to all those things, even if you're unwilling to work. Whereas the more constrained, the more right-wing view says, okay, you have the right to make the choice of working and getting the benefits of that, or not working and suffering the consequences, but you don't have a right to things if you can't work. Like you don't have a right to certain objects or certain things. You only have the right to act in a state of nature as long as you're not oppressing anyone else, and like the whatever you own the consequences of your actions, in a sense. Whereas again, the more constrained view is you have the right to receive these things. You have the right to get these things, even if you've done nothing to earn them. You just get them because that is your. And I don't think I'm strawmanning that at all. That seems to be the actual case. Then the second definition: absence of subjection to foreign domination or despotic government. So this is more, again, like when they talk about government, I guess you could talk about government in the organization or government as you govern your own body, you whatever group we're talking about here. The smallest group being the individual, or a large group being a society or a government. Again, foreign domination, referring to someone else outside you. The absence of subjection to foreign domination. So this is the term, actually. This fits. It's a bit worded a bit weird. But this is rather the good definition that the more constrained view would take. That is the absence of subjection to foreign domination. So again, if someone is born into a poor lifestyle, and overall they're in let's say they're in a free capitalist society, and they drew their card and they got a bad choice. Like they've been dealt some bad cards. The society just, like, they got unlucky. They were born with maybe a low IQ, like maybe they were born with a disability, something that kind of hinders they're a bit of a slow learner, something like that. You can say, let's say, just rather than something specific, in general, they drew some bad cards. They were unlucky. in life. They were born poor and that kind of thing. Well, as long as nobody is specifically holding them back, nobody is controlling them, they still have freedom. They still have the freedom to take certain routes of whatever they can do throughout like a state of nature sense. They can do whatever they want in that sense. They can take certain routes. But they still, again, they were dealt bad cards. They would have to work harder than some other people. Other people have been given, like, they were born rich and they're spoiled throughout their whole life, and they were given enough money, inherited from their parents, that they'll never have to work again. You could say, sure, you could say that's unfair. Sure, I acknowledge that. That's kind of unfair that one person has total, like, never has to work in their life, while the other person pretty much, they drew the bad cards. They were unlucky. They were born unlucky, and it's not their fault at all. But even in the sense, that's not any kind of oppression there. There's no lack of freedom there as long as government is not holding any kind of forceful organization. As long as nobody is forcing them to do anything, they still have freedom. Now again, freedom isn't everything. I'm pointing that out here. Freedom is not everything. So again, there are still problems there. There's still, like, hopefully charity could get involved and help that person. But, like, again, there's still problems. But on the scale of, like, freedom to tyranny, they still have freedom. So that hopefully makes sense. Again, it's the lack of, it's only one scale. So when you look at peak freedom and I'm saying, like, oh, living on a desert island is freedom, that doesn't mean that what pro-freedom people want is, in this definition, is to live on an island by themselves. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that on that scale, and there's many scales, there's many different, like, there's trade-offs. Again, like freedom or security. Like, some people do give up freedom for security, and that is true. Like, if you go to prison, you will get 3 meals a day, you will get food, you'll get company, maybe not the best company, but you'll get all kinds of things if you go to prison. If you commit a crime to be thrown in prison, you are giving up your freedom, but there are still some upsides to that. In my view, like, that's not a good trade-off at all. But just to keep in mind that peak freedom is not perfection. Peak freedom is not complete an ideal society. It is not perfect. It is just one scale of many to talk about. So again, like, the nice thing about society is if you take this more constrained definition of, like, a free market capitalist society gets better anyway in other things. Like, the right to a smartphone is not freedom. Like, you don't freedom does not mean you have a right to a smartphone. However, under a free market capitalist society, you will inevitably get smartphones for cheap, because that's a benefit of a free society. But the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. So there's, again, can you be imprisoned or enslaved by nature? Can natural consequences constrain you? I mean, natural consequences can constrain you, but they can't imprison or enslave you. And I think that's where the big difference is there, where, again, in the sense of the more constrained right-wing view, if you are not being imprisoned or enslaved, you might have loads of other problems. Society, like, life still might not be that great, but in that sense, you would still have freedom. And again, like, if you want to trade that off for security, I'm not begrudging you at all. I'm not blaming you at all. People do that all the time. Like, when they put, it's all complete trade-offs, I should say. Again, the state of being physically unrestricted and able to move easily. I mean, that's a bit of a narrower definition, but again, like, if they say physically, or the state of being physically unrestricted. Well, if you just say the state of being unrestricted, again, society does, or not society, but nature does restrict your choices. But that doesn't, again, nature cannot oppress you, if that makes sense. So again, nature cannot, I understand that nature can cause hardships, nature can cause huge problems. Again, there's a reason we have shelter, because nature can be pretty harsh. Natural disasters in that, but nature is not oppressing you. Nature is not taking away your freedom. It's doing some bad stuff. But it can't oppress you in that sense. It cannot restrict your own freedom from the constrained view. Whereas, of course, if you suffer from a natural disaster, your choices are a lot more limited. You might die. The constrained view says that's not a restriction of freedom. It's still a bad thing. It's still an awful thing, but it's not necessarily a restriction of freedom because you're not being oppressed. Whereas the more unconstrained view, it seems that the left generally takes the view of, again, the right not to suffer from this, the right not to be involved in this, or the right not to die in a car crash, that kind of thing. Like, I've seen that example used before. The right to not die from cancer, kind of thing. So again, like free healthcare, for example. Free in the sense of, like, government-funded healthcare. So in a capitalist society, we would say, like, that's not necessarily another aspect of that's not something that necessarily grants you more freedom, because again, government restricts that, government puts controls on that, government makes you pay for it and makes you participate in the system. It's forcing you to do something that you wouldn't otherwise be part of. It's making you fund something that necessarily, like, again, there are some people, like, you have to acknowledge that there are some people that under a free healthcare system that would lose from that. Because even though they have free access to healthcare, there's someone that, let's say, they exercise 8 hours a day, or 8 hours a day. They exercise every day. They exercise quite a bit. They are very healthful. They watch what they put in their body. They're very healthy. They live to the ripe old age of 95 without a free healthcare system. And under that society without a free healthcare system, they would have never had to pay for healthcare, because again, like the only time they would ever have to pay for healthcare would be in their last few months of life or whatever, their last few years of life, and in that sense they would have saved up enough money to pay for it. But it would have been way cheaper if they only paid for that last bit of, if it would have been way cheaper if they only paid for their stay at the hospital rather than pay for chip into their system, to funding the system as a whole. So you'd say for some people, like, it's up to their choice there. The constrained view would say, again, if you put a government-funded or a government-controlled healthcare system, you are restricting their freedom, because government is taking control of that and forcing you to participate in the system. Whereas from the more unconstrained view, it's all down to, again, results, like having that ability, to having the choice to go for healthcare, the choice to go to the hospital without paying anything. I mean, obviously, again, you pay through taxes and that, but the ability to go to the hospital and not pay for that, I guess, is in a sense their freedom, because that is freedom in their sense, and how they would define it. I'm starting to stumble over my words because I'm trying to think of different ways to define it, because I think I've defined it pretty well, but again, for those still watching, I guess I haven't defined it well enough, but I'm almost done here. I'm trying to word it in as best of a way as I can, and I'm trying to keep in mind, again, where it does sound pretty great to have the freedom to do other things, it does sound great to have a freedom to get healthcare kind of thing. But then you have to keep in mind that under a free market system where you don't have a right to healthcare, you still get cheap healthcare. Like, that's why I'm pro-capitalism. Where in a free society with overall very few government regulations on things, you would have cheap, affordable healthcare. I work in healthcare. I'm pretty sure, like, from what I've seen, regulations aren't making anything better. That's a whole different topic. The idea is that the nice thing about the more right-wing, the more constrained view definition of freedom is that even though they're not saying things are a right, you still get access to them in a sense. Again, capitalism has brought access to all of these different things without them being a right. We don't have a right to food, but yet we still have food in abundance. That's the great thing in more capitalist societies. Like, that's the great thing, that even though you don't have a right to that, even though the right or the more constrained view says you don't have the freedom to get free food, you still get an option. Like, in a free society, you still have that. If that makes sense. But the state of not being subjected to or affected by a personal undesirable thing. Again, that's where the definitions get a bit weird from. The state of not being subjected to, again, the right to not get cancer kind of thing. It's like nobody has a right to not get cancer. It's unfair. It's awful that some people get cancer, and it's terrible. But in the sense of, do you have the right not to? Well, that's not necessarily true. It's when we're talking about human rights, it's something where just because you don't have a right to something doesn't mean that it's bad if you doesn't mean that we think it's bad if you don't get it kind of thing. Or that it'd be a good thing if you got it. So again, a right, you don't have a right not to get cancer. If you get cancer, that you're not being oppressed, your freedom has not been restricted. It's still a bad thing. It's still awful. And hopefully a free society does the research. They try to overcome that. But it is not a restriction of your freedom. The power of self-determination attributed to the will, the quality of being independent of fate or necessity. Again, this is something more that is the unconstrained, the left-wing definition. Because again, the quality of being independent of fate or necessity. Now again, like, you don't have the right to, you don't have the freedom from nature. Like, things are as they are. Like, you don't have, you cannot be free from starvation if you have access to food and don't eat kind of thing. Like, you don't have the freedom to not die under the age of 100, that kind of thing. Like, that's not, and if you, that's not seen as that kind of freedom. It's not a freedom of, again, a freedom from consequences, as they say. If the consequences are natural and just the state of nature, again, like, if you drink a bunch of alcohol, you're probably gonna have a hangover the next day. And you don't have the freedom from. It's not an aspect of freedom to say you're unfree if you get a hangover the next day. You haven't lost freedom. You're not being oppressed in any way if you have a hangover the next day. That's just the natural consequences of drinking alcohol. Whereas again, the right-wing view, like that's the right-wing view, whereas the more unconstrained left-wing view is again the freedom from consequences, as it seems to be. But I think we're good there. Honestly, I think I've really driven this into the ground. I just kind of wanted to cover it very thoroughly. And again, this is a video. You can click away whenever you want. So hopefully, once you finally understood what I was trying to say, you didn't go all the way in. But if you did, thank you, because that helps. That helps out the channel. For every minute watched of a YouTube video on my channel, that YouTube sees that as a good thing and tries to promote the channel. So I appreciate that. If this made sense to you, hit the like button. If you're still completely confused, and if I made it even worse, let me know in the comment section. Again, I tried to, I thought about this a lot before. I thought about this for about 3 days before I actually made the video. And then I'm still kind of stumbling over my words because it's very, there's a lot of things like I feel the need to add in. Because again, I think the reason we see this different definition is because, again, freedom from consequences sounds like a great thing. Or freedom, like a right to food, a right to this stuff sounds like a great thing, but we see in practice that actually kind of works out the other way. So which freedom do I side with? I mean, I side with the more right-wing constrained view of freedom. Why? Because you see that you actually could kind of get the second definition of freedom with the first. Then actually when you get when you do the more freedom from government overreach or freedom from being forced to do something, when you let people, like a capitalist society, there are all kinds of restrictions to a human being in a capitalist society. In a free market capitalist society, there are loads of things that you can't, again, like you're going to get a hangover the next day kind of thing if you drink alcohol. You can't just not get a job and expect to be taken care of. You don't have the freedom to not get a job and be taken care of. But the nice thing about this, taking this definition of freedom, is that things tend to work better. Like as we noticed, these societies that adopt this definition of freedom, the more constrained right-wing definition of freedom, the more libertarian definition of freedom, society is overall better off. Society is better. People have more of the second kind of freedom. So it's more that, again, like if you think you have the right to healthcare, or having healthcare is in a sense more free than not having healthcare, or having free like government-run healthcare makes you more free than a private system. Again, like in a free market capitalist system, they tend to make, if you want something, it becomes more abundant. Like we produce things. It's a production society where if people want something, it gets produced. And the cost of it goes down over time as well. So you do get that second kind of freedom by abiding by the constraints of the first freedom, or of the more right-wing freedom. So yeah, again, hopefully that made sense. Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more. If you made it this far, you're probably already a subscriber. But again, subscribe. That helps me out a lot. And thanks for watching.